A Mustang horse was trapped on the edge of a deadly cliff, and every second counted as the ground beneath its hooves crumbled away. A man, armed with only a rope and a strong sense of determination, risked everything to save the animal, even though it didn't trust him. What happened after their paths crossed would make you question everything you know about courage, survival, and the unspoken bond between man and animal. Get ready for a story that will both break your heart and inspire your spirit. The late afternoon sun hung low over Montana's Bitterroot Range, casting long shadows over the rugged landscape. Ethan Cross, a skilled guide with over a decade of experience navigating dangerous trails, was no stranger to nature's fierce beauty. But today, as he carefully made his way down a narrow path along the cliffs, something caught his eye that made his heart skip a beat. A Mustang stood precariously on a ledge, barely wide enough to support his trembling hooves. Its chestnut coat shimmered under the sun, but it was covered in sweat and dirt. Its wide eyes were filled with fear as small rocks tumbled beneath its hooves, falling into the abyss below, where jagged rocks awaited like the teeth of a predator. The scene was dangerously breathtaking. A life was hanging in the balance. Ethan stopped, his heart racing as he analyzed the situation. The horse was stuck. Its hind leg was tangled in a patch of twisted brambles, which seemed to have prevented it from slipping off the ledge completely. But every time the Mustang moved, it only made the situation worse, bringing it closer to the edge. Ethan realized he had minutes, maybe even seconds, to act. "Easy there," Ethan murmured softly, his voice carried by the wind. He knew the Mustang probably couldn't hear him over its own panicked breathing, but he spoke anyway, hoping to calm the chaos with his words. His first instinct was to call for help, but there was no time. His radio was useless, miles away in his backpack, with no signal for miles. It was just him, a rope, and a dangerous drop. Ethan carefully moved closer, his boots finding stable footing on the uneven terrain. The ledge below him was steep, and even the most experienced climbers would hesitate to go down it. But Ethan didn't hesitate. This horse needed him, and he wasn't going to walk away. He had made that mistake once before, and it had cost him dearly. As he crouched, he saw that the Mustang's breathing was shallow and fast. Its chest rose and fell rapidly from exhaustion. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said gently, "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." His calm voice betrayed the urgency within him. He uncoiled the rope, his hands moving quickly but steadily. He would need to loop the rope around the Mustang to stabilize it before trying to free its leg. But this was a wild horse, strong, terrified, and unpredictable. If it panicked, both of them could easily end up at the bottom of the ravine. Ethan moved in closer, the sheer drop off to his side making his nerves tense. The Mustang flinched, its hooves scraping dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm here to help," he whispered once more, his voice almost drowned out by the wind. Slowly, Ethan managed to get the rope around the Mustang's body. His hands shook as he tightened the knot, securing the animal to a nearby rock outcrop. For a brief moment, the Mustang stood still, its instincts at war with its exhaustion. Ethan thought the Mustang might bolt, but then it stopped, its dark eyes locking onto his. A spark of hope flickered in Ethan's chest. "That's it," he said softly. "You're doing great." Now came the hardest part. The brambles around the Mustang's leg were tight, digging into its flesh and drawing blood. Blood. Ethan pulled out his pocket knife, each movement slow and deliberate. He began cutting through the branches, the sharp snap of the blade echoing in the stillness. The Mustang trembled, but stayed still, not pulling away. "Almost there," Ethan murmured, sweat dripping down his face. The sun had lowered, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. He didn't dare glance down at the abyss below, a silent reminder of the danger they were in. Finally, the last branch snapped away. The Mustang wobbled but didn't fall, its freed leg shaking as it shifted its weight. Ethan quickly got to his feet, tightening his grip on the rope as the horse steadied itself. For a moment, neither of them moved, the only sound the wind whistling through the canyon. "You're okay," Ethan said, his voice cracking with relief. "You're okay." The Mustang didn't run. Instead, it stood there, breathing heavily, its eyes fixed on Ethan. In that brief moment, Something unspoken passed between them, a fragile connection forged by shared survival. Ethan knew the danger wasn't over yet. They still had to climb back up, and the ledge was just as treacherous. But for the first time, he believed they could make it. The Mustang's eyes darted nervously, its body tense. Ethan slowly backed away, giving the animal space. He could feel the weight of its fear, the wild instincts pushing it to run at any moment. The ledge was still unstable, every step a risk. But there was no other choice. They had to move. "All right, buddy," Ethan murmured, gripping the rope tightly. "We got to get you out of here. One step at a time." The Mustang snorted, tossing its head as if protesting. The deep cuts on its hind legs still bled, crimson streaks staining its chestnut coat. Ethan winced at the sight, knowing the pain the horse must have felt. But there was no time to treat the wounds. The cliff was no place for hesitation. Slowly, Ethan began climbing back up the path, keeping the rope taut but loose enough not to startle the horse. Each step was careful, his boots searching for stable footing on the rocky terrain. The Mustang hesitated, its hooves slipping slightly on the loose rocks. But Ethan's calm voice steadied it. "You're stronger than this," he said, just as much to himself as to the horse. "Trust me." The climb was exhausting. Sweat poured from Ethan's brow, mixing with the dirt on his face. His muscles burned as he pulled himself and the Mustang up the steep incline, but he couldn't stop. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows, and Ethan knew they were racing against time. About halfway up, the Mustang froze. Its ears flattened and its body trembled as it stared down at the drop below. Ethan could see panic building in its eyes, the quiver in its legs that meant it might rear. Dropping to his knees, he anchored himself with the rope. Hey, he called quickly, his voice firm but soothing. "Look at me. Don't look down. Keep your eyes on me." The Mustang hesitated, its nostrils flaring as it snorted in terror. Ethan's heart raced, but he kept his ground, holding the rope steady. Slowly, the Mustang's eyes shifted back to him. Its breathing was ragged, but it didn't rear up. Instead, it took a careful step forward. The rope tightened in Ethan's hands. "That's it," Ethan said, his voice full of relief. "You're doing great." They moved in slow, cautious steps, the Mustang pausing to catch his breath every few steps. Ethan's legs felt like lead, his hands raw from gripping the rope, but he refused to stop. Every step brought them closer to the top, closer to safety. As they neared the final stretch, a gust of wind whipped through the canyon, kicking up dust and debris. The Mustang spooked, its hooves slipping dangerously close to the edge. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing the rope with both hands and digging his heels into the ground. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice desperate. The horse stumbled but managed to regain its footing, its wide eyes locking onto Ethan's as if seeking reassurance. Ethan didn't let go. He pulled with all his strength, his muscles screaming in protest as he guided the Mustang back onto the path. The moment stretched out like an eternity, but finally, they reached the top of the cliff. Ethan collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The Mustang stood a few feet away, its legs trembling but stable. For a moment, neither of them moved, the only sound the wind howling through the canyon and distant bird calls. "You did it," Ethan whispered, looking up at the Mustang. His green eyes met its dark, intelligent gaze. "We did it." The Mustang didn't bolt. Instead, it stood still, its ears swiveling as it took in its surroundings. Ethan could see the exhaustion in its posture, the way its body sagged with relief. But there was something else, a quiet understanding, a fragile bond formed in the heat of survival. Ethan reached for his backpack and pulled out a small water bottle. He poured some into his hand and offered it to the Mustang. The horse hesitated, sniffing the water before lowering its head and drinking carefully. "There you go," Ethan said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're going to be okay." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the canyon in a deep wash of orange and purple, both man and horse stood silently, finding solace in their shared survival. Ethan knew their journey was far from over. The Mustang was injured, and the nearest town was miles away. But for the first time, he felt a spark of hope. Together, they had conquered the cliff, and now together, they could face whatever came next. The cool night air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. As Ethan guided the Mustang away from the cliff's edge, the adrenaline of their escape began to fade. replaced by the harsh reality of their situation. The horse's injuries needed care, and they were still far from any help. The Mustang limped beside him, its steps uneven and painful. Ethan could see fresh blood trickling down its hind leg, dark against its chestnut coat. His heart ached at the sight. The horse had fought so hard to survive, but it was still vulnerable, teetering on the brink of exhaustion. Ethan glanced up at the night sky, where the stars stretched endlessly, their faint light steady despite the darkness. He pulled out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the night. He scanned the area ahead and saw a dense thicket that opened into a small clearing. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for the night. "Come on, buddy," Ethan said softly, giving the rope a gentle tug. "Just a little further." The Mustang hesitated, its ears flicking back, but it followed. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the animal's resilience. It had every reason to resist, to give up, but it hadn't. Somehow, it had chosen to trust him, a stranger, and that trust weighed heavily on Ethan's heart. When they reached the clearing, Ethan set down his pack and began to set up a small camp. He laid out a blanket on the soft grass and coaxed the Mustang to lie down. The horse resisted at first, its muscles tense as Ethan approached. But with his calm voice and gentle touch, the Mustang finally gave in. "Easy now," Ethan murmured, crouching beside the animal. He reached for his first aid kit, his fingers fumbling slightly with the worn fabric of his pack. "Let's take a look at that leg." The Mustang's dark eyes watched him warily as he began to clean the wound. Ethan worked quickly, but with precision, his hands steady despite the exhaustion weighing on him. The injury was deep. The brambles had left jagged cuts along the Mustang's leg, but there were no signs of a break. Relief washed over Ethan, though he knew the journey ahead would still be tough. "You're tough," Ethan said with a faint smile. "I'll give you that." The Mustang huffed softly, its nostrils flaring. Ethan took it as a good sign. At least the horse still had some fight in it. He finished cleaning the wound, wrapping it carefully with a bandage from his kit. As he worked, he spoke softly to the horse, his voice steady in the quiet night. "You know," he said, leaning back on his heels, "I wasn't always good at this. I used to think I could do everything on my own, but life has a way of humbling you, doesn't it?" The Mustang didn't respond, of course, but Ethan felt a strange comfort in talking to the animal. There was something about his calm presence and quiet strength that made him feel less alone. He hadn't realized how much he needed that. As the hours passed, the clearing grew colder, and the night wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. Ethan built a small fire, the flames flickering and casting long shadows across the trees. He sat beside the Mustang, watching as the horse rested its head on the ground, its body finally relaxing. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the past, to the choices that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the mistakes he'd made, the people he'd let down, and the quiet guilt that followed him wherever he went. But tonight, as he sat next to this wild, injured creature, something felt different. Redemption, he realized, wasn't something you found all at once. It was earned step by step, choice by choice. The Mustang shifted, its ears flicking at the crackling fire. Ethan reached out and gently brushed his hand against the horse's neck. This time, the horse didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a low, contented sigh. "Maybe we'll both figure this out," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. Together, under the stars, which now shone even brighter, they shared a moment of peace. The clearing was still, the world holding its breath, as man and horse found a fragile bond. Ethan leaned back against his pack, his eyes heavy with sleep, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a road ahead full of unknowns and dangers, but for now they had each other, and that was enough. As the sun slowly rose the next morning, bathing the clearing in a soft golden light, Ethan stirred from his makeshift bed. His back ached from the uneven ground. He glanced over at the Mustang, still lying down, its head resting on the earth. The horse's chestnut coat shimmered faintly in the sunlight, but its breathing was labored, and Ethan could see the tension in its muscles. "Morning, buddy," Ethan said softly, sitting up and stretching. His voice broke the silence of the dawn, causing the Mustang's ears to twitch. The horse lifted its head slightly, blinking at him with dark, intelligent eyes. Ethan smiled, relieved that the horse was still alert. He rummaged through his pack and pulled out a small canteen of water. He poured some into a shallow dish and placed it in front of the Mustang. The horse hesitated, sniffing the water cautiously before drinking a few tentative sips. "That's it," Ethan encouraged. "You've got to stay strong. We've got a long way to go." He checked the bandage on the horse's leg, wincing as he saw fresh blood seeping through. The wound was worse than he'd hoped, and without proper care, infection could become a serious threat. He knew they had to reach the nearest town as soon as possible, but the journey would be tough for both of them. As Ethan packed up camp, the Mustang struggled to its feet. Its movements were slow and deliberate. Ethan watched it closely, ready to step in if the horse stumbled, but the Mustang managed to stand, its legs trembling but stable. "You're tougher than you look," Ethan said, patting the horse gently on the neck. "Let's get moving." The two of them set off, the forest coming alive around them with birdsong and the rustling of leaves. The path ahead was uneven, winding through dense trees and rocky terrain. Ethan kept a steady hand on the rope, guiding the Mustang with patience and care. At first, the horse was hesitant, its steps unsure. But as the hours passed, the Mustang began to move with more confidence, following Ethan more steadily. The sky, which had been clear in the morning, began to change as they continued their journey. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, their edges tinged with a foreboding gray. Ethan frowned and glanced up at the shifting weather. "Storm's coming," he muttered to himself. The air felt heavier, the kind of weight that precedes a downpour. Ethan urged the Mustang to quicken its pace. They needed to find shelter before the rain hit. As they reached a narrow ridge, the first drops began to fall, the wind picking up and whipping through the trees. Ethan tightened his grip on the rope, trying to maintain his balance as the horse's steps grew more uncertain. The Mustang's ears flicked back, and it let out a nervous snort. "It's okay," Ethan said, his voice calm despite the tension rising in his chest. "We're almost there." The rain arrived suddenly, pouring down in a torrential downpour that soaked them within seconds. The path turned slick with mud, making each step a struggle to keep balance. Ethan's boots slipped on the wet ground, and the Mustang stumbled behind him, its hooves skidding dangerously close to the edge of the ridge. "Easy, easy," Ethan shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind and rain. He pulled on the rope, steadying the horse as it regained its footing. The panic in the Mustang's eyes mirrored his own, but Ethan couldn't afford to let fear take over. Through the haze of rain, he spotted an overhang of rock jutting out from the ridge. It wasn't much, but it would offer some shelter from the storm. He led the Mustang toward it, each step a battle against the storm. By the time they reached the overhang, both man and horse were soaked to the bone. Ethan tied the rope securely to a nearby tree, making sure the Mustang wouldn't wander off in the chaos. He crouched beside the horse, his body shivering from the cold. "You're okay," he said, his voice hoarse as he placed a hand on the Mustang's neck, feeling its warmth against his palm. "We're okay." The storm raged on, the wind howling and the rain pounding against the earth. Ethan leaned back against the rock, his mind racing. The journey ahead seemed impossible, but giving up wasn't an option. The Mustang needed him, and somehow that gave him the strength to keep going. Hours passed, and eventually, the storm began to subside. The rain lightened to a gentle drizzle, and the Mustang shifted beside him, its body relaxing as the tension eased away. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling a glimmer of hope break through the exhaustion. The road ahead was still long, but they had made it through the storm together. They could face whatever came next. The morning after the storm felt like a gift. The sky was a brilliant blue, clear of the heavy clouds that had hung over them the day before. The forest sparkled with raindrops clinging to the leaves, and the air smelled fresh and clean. Ethan stretched, wincing as his muscles protested from the previous day's strain. He turned to the Mustang, who stood a few feet away, grazing on a patch of... Once the wound was rewrapped, Ethan stood up, brushing the dirt off his knees. He took a long look at the path ahead. The storm had left the trail muddy and slick, but he could see the edge of the forest thinning in the distance. Beyond it lay open fields, and if he remembered correctly, a small ranch about 10 miles away. It wasn't much, but it could be their best chance for help. "All right," Ethan said, tightening the straps on his pack. "Let's see what we can do." The Mustang followed him willingly, its steps more confident than the day before. They moved at a slow but steady pace, the sun warming their backs as they left the shadows of the forest behind. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at the horse's resilience. Just days ago, it had been near death, yet now it was pushing forward with a determination that mirrored his own. As they reached the edge of the woods, the landscape opened up before them. Rolling fields stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with patches of wildflowers and clusters of trees. In the distance, Ethan could make out the faint outline of a barn, its red roof standing out against the greenery. "There it is," Ethan said, pointing. "That's where we're headed." The Mustang's ears perked up, its eyes following Ethan's gesture. The sight of the open field seemed to give the horse new energy, and it quickened its pace, gently tugging on the rope. Ethan smiled, feeling a renewed sense of hope. The ranch was still a long way off, but they were closer than ever to safety. The journey across the fields was easier than the treacherous forest, but it was no less exhausting. The sun climbed higher, its heat beating down on them as they trudged forward. Ethan shared his water with the Mustang, rationing what little he had left. Every step felt like a small victory, a triumph over the odds stacked against them. As they neared the ranch, a figure appeared in the distance. A man stood near the barn, his hand shielding his eyes as he watched them approach. Ethan waved, too fatigued to speak. The man waved back, then began walking toward them, his pace quickening as he got closer. "You need help?" the man called out, his voice carrying across the field. Ethan nodded, his throat too dry to respond. When they finally met, the man's eyes widened at the sight of the injured Mustang. "Good Lord," he said, his voice filled with concern. "What happened?" "It's a long story," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. "Can you help him?" The man, who introduced himself as Hank, didn't hesitate. He led them to the barn, where he helped Ethan tend to the Mustang's wounds with proper supplies. Hank's knowledge of horses was clear in the way he moved, steady and sure as he worked. "You've got a fighter here," Hank said, patting the Mustang's neck. "He's lucky you found him." Ethan glanced at the horse, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think we're both lucky." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the ranch, Ethan sat outside the barn, watching the Mustang graze in the paddock. The horse moved with a grace that belied its injuries, its spirit unbroken despite everything it had endured. Ethan felt a deep peace he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he truly believed they were going to be all right. The next morning, he stood by the paddock fence, watching Spirit graze in the soft morning light. The Mustang's movements were still cautious, its injured leg wrapped securely with fresh bandages, but there was a quiet strength in the way it carried itself now. Ethan leaned against the wooden rail, a small smile on his lips. It was a sight he hadn't dared to hope for just days ago. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" he said aloud, though he knew the Mustang wouldn't answer. Still, it felt right to speak his thoughts. "Tougher than anyone gave you credit for, including me." Hank approached from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "He's looking better," he said, nodding toward Spirit. "You did good, Ethan. Not many people would have gone through all that to save a wild horse." Ethan shrugged, his gaze never leaving the Mustang. "I don't know if it's what I did or what he did. He's got a will to survive that you don't see every day." Hank chuckled, leaning on the fence beside him. "That's true. But he wouldn't have made it out of that canyon without you. And judging by the way he sticks close to you, I'd say he knows it." As if on cue, Spirit lifted his head and turned to look at them. His dark eyes seemed to hold a deep understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. Ethan felt a mix of pride, gratitude, and an unshakable connection he couldn't fully name. "Does he have a name?" Hank asked, breaking the silence. Ethan hesitated before shaking his head. "I hadn't thought about it." "Well, you should," Hank said with a grin. "A horse like that deserves a name." Ethan considered the suggestion, his mind drifting back to the cliff, to the storm, and to every moment they had fought together to survive. "How about Spirit?" he said finally. "Seems fitting." Hank nodded. "Spirit it is." The next few days passed in a blur of routine and care. Ethan spent hours tending to Spirit, cleaning his wounds and making sure he had enough food and water. Each day, the Mustang grew stronger. His movements became more confident, and his coat regained its healthy shine. It wasn't long before Spirit was trotting around the paddock, his injured leg barely slowing him down. But as Spirit healed, Ethan found himself facing a difficult decision. The ranch was a temporary haven, a place for Spirit to recover, but it wasn't his home. The Mustang belonged in the wild, where he could run free, untethered by fences and ropes. The thought of letting Spirit go weighed heavily on Ethan's heart. He had grown attached to the horse in a way he hadn't expected. Spirit wasn't just an animal, he was a symbol of resilience, a reminder of the will to keep moving forward even when the odds seemed impossible. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, Ethan stood in the paddock with Spirit. The Mustang nuzzled his shoulder, a gesture that felt almost like a thank you. Ethan ran a hand along Spirit's neck, his voice soft and steady. "You've got your strength back," he said. "You don't need me anymore." Spirit snorted softly, almost as if in protest. Ethan chuckled, though the sound was tinged with sadness. "I'm serious. You're meant to be out there, running wild, not stuck in a place like this." Hank appeared at the gate, his expression somber. "You've decided then?" he asked. Ethan nodded, the decision feeling heavy in his chest. "Yeah, it's time." Hank clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. It's hard, but it's what's best for him." Together, they opened the paddock gate. Ethan led Spirit to the edge of the field, where the open plains stretched endlessly before them. The Mustang hesitated, its ears flicking back as it looked at Ethan one last time. For a moment, Ethan thought Spirit might stay, that the bond between them was too strong to break. But then, with a flick of his tail, Spirit bolted. He galloped across the field, his chestnut coat gleaming in the fading sunlight. Ethan watched him go, a mix of pride and heartache swelling in his chest. "He'll be okay," Hank said quietly. "And so will you." Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "Yeah," he said softly, "we both will." The fields were quiet the next morning, the early light gently spreading over the rolling hills. Ethan sat on the fence near the paddock, sipping from a mug of coffee Hank had handed him before heading into the barn. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for the familiar silhouette he knew wouldn't be there anymore. Spirit was gone, galloping back to the life he was meant to live. The thought filled Ethan with a mix of emotions, pride and sadness intertwined in a way that left a hollow ache in his chest. He had done the right thing, but that didn't make it any easier. The Mustang's departure had left a void in Ethan's routine. The hours he spent caring for Spirit, talking to him, and ensuring his survival had been more than just a mission. They had been a lifeline for Ethan too. It was as if the horse's struggle mirrored his own. Now, with Spirit gone, Ethan felt adrift. Hank's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You're quiet this morning," the older man said, leaning against the fence beside him. "Missing him already?" Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, feels strange not having him here. I keep expecting to see him standing by the fence waiting for me." Hank chuckled. "That horse was special, no doubt about it. But you gave him a chance, Ethan. You gave him freedom. That's more than most people would have done." Ethan took a sip of his coffee, the warmth grounding him. "I just hope he's okay out there. He's a Mustang," Hank said with a shrug. "Born to survive, born to roam. He'll be just fine." Ethan nodded, but his thoughts drifted back to the moment Spirit had bolted across the field. The way the Mustang's muscles rippled with strength, the sunlight catching on his chestnut coat, it was a sight Ethan would never forget, etched into his memory like a photograph. Spirit had looked back at him once, just for a moment, before disappearing into the wild. The day stretched on, quiet and uneventful. Ethan busied himself helping Hank with chores around the ranch, trying to fill the hours and distract his mind. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape, he found himself wandering back to the edge of the field. He stood there for a long time, his hands resting on the wooden gate, watching the horizon. The vastness of the plains seemed to stretch on forever. The tall grass swayed gently in the breeze. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. It was peaceful here, but it wasn't where he belonged, not anymore. Hank joined him, leaning on the gate beside him. "You thinking about moving on?" he asked, his tone understanding. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. Spirit reminded me of something I've forgotten. That it's okay to keep going, even when it's hard. Staying here has been good, but it's time for me to figure out what's next." Hank clapped him on the back. Well, whatever it is, you'll do just fine. And hey, don't be a stranger. You're always welcome here. Thanks, Hank, Ethan said quietly but sincerely, for everything. As the last light of day faded into twilight, Ethan felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The journey with Spirit had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The Mustang's fight for survival had reignited something in him, a spark, a purpose, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is still hope. Ethan turned from the gate, his steps slow but steady as he walked back toward the ranch. He didn't know where the road would lead him next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he made a silent promise to himself to live with the same courage and freedom that Spirit had shown him. Because life, like the wild, was meant to be lived fully. If this story touched your heart, remember that acts of kindness, no matter how small, can change lives, both human and animal. Just like Ethan and Spirit's journey, we all have the power to create hope and freedom.